Today I'm going to be talking really about two things. First, I'm going to be talking about how to really better understand and analyse crime and safety problems in your local communities. And I'm also going to be talking about what works in terms of reducing or preventing crime or improving safety, with a particular focus on CCTV, lighting and CPTED, given the relevance obviously to the PSIF grants. These are two topics I am really quite passionate about and spend most of my time at the AIC conducting research into. So hopefully I can share with you some information and advice that is useful not only here with your application for this particular grant program, but perhaps for some of the other work that you might be doing within council or within your local communities. I used a bit of creative license with my presentation title. Deviate a little bit from the agenda. I could have easily called this the science or the science of problem solving. Because really what I'm trying to, I guess, talk through and encourage you to do is really test your ideas about what you think your problem is in your community and what you think the solution will do to address that problem. So that's really what I'm trying to get across. The reason I've called it the art of problem solving is because I think there's a little bit of creativity to it. There's a little bit of creativity in terms of the sorts of information you might want to draw upon, the way you interpret and understand that information, and there's creativity in the sorts of responses that you might come up with in terms of trying to deal with your local crime and safety issues. The presentation today is really in 4 parts. I'm not going to be speaking for the entire time. I'm going to start by giving a fairly sort of general introduction to what I think is really important around crime prevention and problem solving. I'm then going to hand over to the wonderful Fiona to talk about what you have here is an amazing resource in the Crime Statistics Agency, and she's going to give an overview of how to access that information. I'm then going to come back and I'm going to talk a little bit more about problem solving. And then at the end of each sort of section, there'll be an opportunity for questions. We're then going to have a morning tea break, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to give you everything you need to know about what works in CCTV, lighting and CPTED. Not just what works, but when it works, what you need to think about in terms of making it work most effectively, and the sorts of things that will make your project a stronger and more effective project in terms of reducing crime. Okay, so I do want to just make a couple of really brief points about crime prevention generally, and then I'm going to start to really hone into the whole problem-solving process. The first point I want to get across is that we absolutely know that the sorts of interventions that are funded through this grant program work. They reduce crime. There is really good international evidence, and I'll go through some of this international evidence, that says these things can actually reduce crime and also improve safety in the community. So that's a really important first point. The second point I want to make is that these things are cost effective. There's also really good evidence that the return on investment is really positive in terms of well designed and well implemented. I'm going to come back to that point, but really well designed, well targeted projects that embrace these sort of infrastructure ideas can be very cost effective. And finally, and it doesn't always feel like this, certainly having worked in crime prevention for some time, there is good public support for prevention. If you give people the opportunity to choose between prevention and punishment, they will choose prevention. The research from overseas in Australia consistently shows this, and over time as well, despite various claims perhaps otherwise. Now, the thing about crime prevention is that good crime prevention can deliver not just reductions in crime and improvements in safety, but other really important outcomes for the community. Things like improved community cohesion, improved quality of life, and also really reducing the financial burden of crime and safety on communities. But, and you can probably sense there's a but coming, poorly planned or poorly implemented crime prevention won't reduce crime at best, and actually can be harmful to communities. And so that's really important. So hopefully you'll get the sense that it's not just finding a good idea, but it's actually planning that idea really well, implementing it well, and of course evaluating it to make sure that you've done what you thought you were going to do. Okay, now, so what are the keys to good crime prevention? Probably no surprise that I'm going to start with by saying problem solving. Adopting and embracing a problem-solving process and working through systematically your problem and coming up with a response, implementing that response and evaluating is absolutely vital to good crime prevention. And that's essentially what I'll use to sort of underpin my presentation today. Making use of the best available evidence is also really important, and there is some really good evidence that you can draw upon in terms of your application here and crime prevention more generally. but not being so tied to the evidence that you don't think about the other things that are important in terms of developing and implementing an effective project. Community engagement, I think Chris and Sean both spoke about the importance of community engagement. We did a review a few years ago looking at various responses to crime prevention and different crime types, particularly focused on New South Wales. And one of the dominant themes through that was the importance of community engagement right from the get-go, right through the project, and how vital that was to actually effective local responses. Partnerships. Partnerships are really important, but not for partnership's sake. There are lots of partnerships that seem a really good idea, but don't actually necessarily deliver on anything. So the idea here is that partnerships are important when it's two or more organisations, groups working together to actually put a good idea into practice. Okay, resources, of course, that's where PSIF grant program and other grant program come in particularly handy, but also knowledge and technical expertise. Things like CCTV, lighting and design, they need certain expertise, they need certain knowledge, and that's really important in terms of making sure that what you're putting in place will work. And of course, it probably seems a little bit self-serving as a researcher to say, you must evaluate, but it's absolutely true. If you don't do an evaluation, you don't know that you've actually made a difference. You don't know that what you're doing has made an impact on your community. Importantly though, you don't know that whether there's an opportunity to improve what you're doing or to do something differently the next time you might be applying for funding, for example. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to walk you through for the rest of the presentation really this whole idea of a problem-solving process. And simply put, there's lots of models. Someone once told, I think Ron Clark or environmental criminologists, that use acronyms. People remember acronyms. So you hear things like SARA and Proctor and CRABE. I'm going to use a few today because I kind of like them as well. But the idea really behind any of these problem-solving processes is the idea of scanning and understanding and analysing your crime problem, developing a response to address that problem, implementing it and reviewing and evaluating. That's the simple problem-solving process. Underpinning that though is a lot more detail in terms of the sorts of things you need to think about. The level of, I guess, drilling down to some of these kind of stages is probably more important. It's important not to be superficial, I guess is what I'm saying, with your problem-solving process. I'm going to try and use a case study. Now, I've picked somewhere from Canberra because I am terrible with geography and I barely know Canberra, let alone anywhere in Victoria. And what I want to use is just to bring this through as I'm talking as a bit of a case study to illustrate some of the points I'm trying to make. And it's really a hypothetical project. Well, it was a hypothetical project, but I'll talk about that shortly. But it's a hypothetical project or a hypothetical case study. Hague Park is, for those who aren't familiar with Canberra, is a really large urban green space just north of the city centre. It's adjacent to kind of hipster centre, which is Braddon, and it's actually an enormous area. This is about half of the green space and expands both sides of Northbourne Avenue. It was actually developed in the early 1920s as a windbreak for Canberra, so that was about as far as Canberra expanded at that point, and it's about 7,000 trees planted in rows, and that's pretty much how it's remained since then. It's one of those places that's much maligned by the Canberran community. There's a lot of attention given to the poor use of public space, where it's such a large area, so close to the city, how well is the space used and available and accessible to the community. But also in terms of safety issues, and there's been a lot of attention around some really kind of quite serious safety problems, but also just a general perception, as I'll talk about. Now, the reason I like it as an example is it's kind of this classic, like it as case studies, it's this classic example of kind of the Canberran kind of bureaucracy that can haunt the ACT sometimes. And it's one of those projects where there was a master plan developed, fantastic master plan in 2012, and then nothing happened for 5 years. Unfortunately, I think somebody got wind of the fact that I use this as a case study and they've just reinvigorated it. So there's now some community engagement stuff going on and they're kind of developing a new master plan. So it kind of ruins my idea. But I still think it's a really nice, neat, hypothetical example to kind of work through and try and illustrate some of the points I want to talk about today. Okay, so now let's start walking through the problem-solving process. And I want to do this fairly systematically, as I said. And I want to start with really analysing and understanding your crime problems. Now, I think most of you are probably coming here with an idea about what you think the problem is and where the problem is and what you should do about it. And really, I'm not suggesting that you're to completely change already. What I'm hoping to get you to do is to really try and unpack that a little bit more, think a little bit more deeper about some of these problems, and really, I guess, try and find the evidence that will help support your applications. The point to make, and lots of people say this, but if you don't understand a problem, you're really only guessing at solutions, and this is absolutely true. We see all the time crime prevention projects that are kind of this solution looking for a problem. Seems like a fantastic idea, but is it really connected to what the problem is? Is it really about, is it really actually going to address the problem? And does that problem even really exist? And so that's kind of what I want to start to sort of really challenge your thinking around. And it's not just about not knowing a problem and not understanding a problem, but actually having a limited understanding of that problem and a really narrow understanding. And that's sort of what I want to broaden your minds a little bit around what we can sort of start to think about. So the first question to ask yourself is, is this really a problem? And I mentioned acronyms. I'm going to use a few. The CHEERS test, terrible acronym, but a really nice way of kind of conceptualising your problem and really making sense about whether this problem exists in your community. And essentially what Ron Clark and John X say is you've got to think through 6 things. Can you provide evidence that the community's experiencing harmful events? Is something happening that's impacting the community? Second, not only are those events happening, but is actually someone being harmed by that? Could be people, could be organisations. Is there some level of harm being experienced? Is there an expectation that somebody should do something about it? If nobody's complaining and there's no expectation that somebody should act, do you really need to do anything about it? Because it's probably a fairly good indication that the problem isn't so serious that it warrants a response. You need to be able to describe the events that make up the problem. You need to be able to, if you can't describe what's going on and what the problem is, then that really weakens your argument as to whether that problem truly exists. It needs to be recurring. I'm going to talk a little bit about acute problems, chronic problems, critical incidents, these sorts of things. But for a problem, particularly when you're talking about some sort of crime prevention response, particularly something like infrastructure, which is pretty permanent, it needs to be a recurring problem. And finally, in terms of dealing with a particular problem, as opposed to dealing with various problems, you need to be able to demonstrate that the events share something. There needs to be something similar about the sorts of events that you're trying to address, because otherwise you're really talking about multiple problems and it might require a diversity of responses. So there's some really kind of key questions that you need to be asking about your problem. So let's assume you've established that you've got a problem. Now, what are the key questions you actually need to ask? And these are kind of pretty basic, but what is the problem? What events are happening? Where do they happen? When do they happen? Who is involved? And how do the events happen? And these are sorts of things that you should be able to describe in your application in terms of actually trying to demonstrate that you understand your problem. And not just the what, when, who, when and how. I think I said when to us, but the why as well. So can you understand and can you explain why these things are happening? Why are those crime events happening in that particular space? What's generating? Why are those people engaging in that behaviour? Why do they happen at that particular time of day? Because that demonstrates, I guess, a depth of understanding that will really help with your targeting of your particular response. And of course, there's lots of information sources that you can draw upon in trying to answer some of these pretty basic questions. The first, of course, is recorded crime data, and Fiona's about to speak about it. We'll speak about that very shortly. But there's lots of other sources, so don't be wedded to crime data. Security data, if you already have CCT infrastructure in place, or you have some sort of other security mechanisms in place, there may be other information that can provide, a more detailed understanding of problems, particularly problems that aren't necessarily crime problems, that don't come to the attention of police. I know lots of councils have some fantastic information on complaints, so complaints from the community, obviously information about graffiti removal, some are around waste management, syringe disposal programs, all these sorts of information sources can really be fantastic in helping to demonstrate the sorts of problems that you're experiencing, particularly in public spaces. Community safety surveys, I know these are quite common amongst local councils, and I'm going to talk really about how you target those for the purpose of identifying problems in particular places. But they're, again, another really valuable source when done well. That's really important. Community consultation, I've talked already about community engagement, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but obviously consulting with your local community in terms of the people that are living there, working there, but also just using the space in which you're trying to deliver a response. consultation with partner agencies. Obviously, your partners will have some fantastic insights into both what the problem is, but also what should be done about it. And obviously, it's really important that you challenge some of those ideas as experts in your community and experts on local crime problems. Safety audits, I'll talk a little bit more about safety audits shortly, but when you're talking about public space and particularly design responses, safety audits are a really critically important part of that process. I'm sure there's a number of you in this room who are probably pretty adept at running safety audits and probably done this a lot as part of the work you've done, but I'll give you a bit of a brief overview of some of the things to consider with that. And finally, media. Now, media is a really important, I guess, source of information in terms of getting a barometer of the sorts of, I guess, concern that might exist within a community. And they can be a useful source of information to demonstrate a problem. But obviously, you need to be thinking carefully about what that media might be presenting, the level of, I guess, the degree to which that media reflects the reality, and whether it's a kind of it's over an exaggeration of the problem, and how useful that really is. But certainly, it's another source of information. I have to say that because I had some media articles up before and a couple of slides ago. So anyway, so there's some fantastic information sources.